Welcome to Shatter.
The moment that changed everything didn't sound dramatic. It sounded irritated, flat, almost bored. We were standing in the open-plan kitchen, the kind designed more for photos than for living. Her laptop was open on the island, a pitch deck frozen mid-slide. Notifications kept lighting up her phone like it was breathing. I had stepped closer to see what she was working on, the way I always had. Quietly, without touching anything. She didn't look up when she snapped that she needed space. That she was sick of me hovering. That I was distracting her. The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the casual impatience people use on interns or waiters who linger too long. The room went still. Not awkward. Empty. She expected the usual adjustment. Me stepping back. Me apologizing with my body language. Me shrinking just enough to restore her focus and her sense of control. That's how it had gone for a while now. I would recalibrate. She would continue. Instead, I picked up my keys. The sound caught her attention. Metal against stone. She finally looked up, annoyance already loaded, ready to finish the thought. She didn't get the chance. I walked past her, opened the front door, and left it open behind me as I stepped out. No argument. No explanation. No slammed door. Just air moving where I used to be. I didn't walk fast. I didn't hesitate either. By the time I reached the car, I could already hear her voice behind me in my head, rehearsing how this was my fault, how I didn't understand pressure, how her work mattered right now, how I would come back once I cooled off. She was wrong about one thing. The wrong person walked out. By the next morning, the separation had already started. Not emotionally. Practically. I called my attorney before I answered any messages. I flagged joint accounts. I withdrew from advisory roles I'd never put my name on publicly. I stepped out of obligations she'd assumed were permanent because they had always been quiet. By afternoon, I was no longer copied on emails. By evening, my calendar was empty in places it had been full for years. Her startup still existed. Her momentum didn't slow. But the invisible systems that had steadied it were no longer running in the background. That night, she texted something casual, something dismissive, as if I were sulking nearby. I didn't respond. And for the first time, the silence wasn't punishment. It was absence. I didn't disappear. I just stopped filling the gaps she never noticed were there. The first crack showed up through someone else. It always does. 2 days after I left, I ran into Mark Caldwell outside a municipal planning office. He was a project liaison I'd worked with for years, the kind of man who measured people by how little they spoke. We didn't stop to talk. He just slowed enough to walk beside me for half a block, eyes forward, voice low. He mentioned my wife's company without saying her name. Mentioned a funding round that hadn't been announced yet. Mentioned a dinner in Manhattan that wasn't on any calendar. Then he said something that didn't sound like gossip, just an observation. That venture money never moves alone. It always follows leverage. He let that sit between us and walked away. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. By the time I reached my car, the pattern was already visible. Presentations scheduled late. Travel that didn't line up with conferences. An investor whose name came up too often for someone who supposedly delegated everything. That evening, I didn't check her social media. I didn't scroll. I didn't look for proof. I logged into the systems I still had access to and watched behavior instead of content. Expense flows. Calendar overlaps. A consulting contract routed through a shell LLC tied to the same fund that had suddenly taken interest in her brand. Nothing explicit. Nothing illegal. Just proximity bought and paid for. I remembered a moment from weeks earlier. A charity mixer where she had stood half a step ahead of me, laughing too loudly at something I couldn't hear. I had adjusted my stance then, without thinking, giving her room to shine. She hadn't noticed. The man beside her had. Now I noticed everything. I didn't confront her. Silence had already shifted the board. Instead, I accelerated the detachment. I declined a meeting that would have smooth zoning approvals she was counting on. I removed my informal sign-off from an infrastructure partnership her advisors assumed was a formality. No announcements. No ultimatums. She sent a voice message that night. Light. Almost playful. She said we needed to reset the tone. That I was being dramatic. That stress was getting to both of us. I didn't listen past the first sentence. By morning, her team was asking questions she didn't have answers to. Small delays. Unreturned calls. A sense that something foundational had gone quiet. She still thought this was about space. It wasn't. It was about access. Proof doesn't arrive like a confession. It arrives like alignment. By the third day, the noise around her grew louder without ever reaching me. That was the difference. Before, I was the buffer. The person who absorbed pressure quietly and redirected it before it touched her. Now the pressure had nowhere to go. I saw it in patterns, not messages. Her company's operating account dipped below a threshold she never monitored because it had never mattered. A bridge transfer she expected to clear by noon didn't. A vendor paused delivery without explanation. None of it was dramatic enough to panic her yet. It was just friction, the kind that makes people check their phones more often. That afternoon, I received a calendar alert that wasn't meant for me. A shared system hadn't been scrubbed yet. A private dinner tagged as strategic alignment, held at a members-only venue I knew well. I designed the utility expansion that kept the place running uninterrupted during peak demand. I knew who paid for privacy there. The investor's name was attached. Daniel Ross, a man whose reputation wasn't built on innovation but on proximity. He didn't grow companies. He positioned himself inside them and let gravity do the rest. I didn't attend. I didn't react. I just removed the last administrative credential that tied my name to her operational backend. That evening, she posted a photo. Clean lighting. Neutral caption. A glass raised just high enough to suggest celebration without committing to what was being celebrated. Comments poured in. Validation in real time. I remembered how she used to ask me to review captions before posting. How she'd wait for my nod before hitting publish. That ritual had faded months ago, replaced by faster feedback loops. Later that night, a mutual contact texted me by accident, meant for someone else. A single line about how impressive it was that she'd locked in Ross's support so quickly. The message was deleted seconds later. I didn't respond. By morning, her tone shifted. The messages stopped being playful. They became clipped, then concerned. She asked if I'd seen a notice from the city, if I'd heard back from a consultant she couldn't reach. She framed everything as logistical coincidence. I didn't answer. By lunch, she showed up at my office unannounced. Not angry, controlled. She stood in the doorway, scanning the room like she was recalibrating her leverage. She said we needed to talk, that things were getting complicated, that she didn't understand why I was being distant when she needed support. I stayed seated. I didn't offer a chair. She left after a few minutes, irritation cracking through her composure for the first time. As the door closed, my phone buzzed once more. A transaction alert. One I hadn't authorized. Someone else was trying to move weight through a system that no longer recognized them. And for the first time, she felt it. I didn't vanish in the way she expected. I stayed exactly where I was, just no longer reachable. That afternoon, I left the office earlier than usual. Not rushed. Not secretive. I drove out of the city without telling anyone where I was going. I turned my phone off halfway there, not out of anger, but out of precision. Systems work best when you remove noise. By evening, she was calling. At first, it was measured. One missed call, then two, then a message asking if my phone was dead, another asking if I was with someone, another reminding me we still had shared responsibilities. I didn't hear any of it. I checked into a quiet hotel outside the metro area, the kind built for people who don't want attention. No valet, no lobby crowd, just a key card and silence. I ordered room service, ate without distraction, and slept without interruption. When I turned my phone back on the next morning, the screen filled itself. She had moved from irritation to alarm overnight. The messages stacked differently now. Shorter, faster, less polished. She said this wasn't funny. She said we needed to be adults. She said investors were asking questions she couldn't answer. She asked where I was. I didn't reply. Instead, I authorized the final separation protocols. I removed myself from joint liabilities. I froze my involvement in any informal agreements that relied on my reputation instead of a contract. I rerouted communications through counsel. Clean, legal, quiet. By noon, her assistant was calling me. By afternoon, one of her board advisors tried. By evening, someone from Ross's firm reached out under the guise of alignment. I ignored all of it. From a distance, I watched the effect ripple outward. Meetings rescheduled. Assumptions corrected. People realizing that what they thought was permanent had actually been voluntary. She posted less that day. When she did, the tone was sharper. Defensive. A performance meant to reassure an audience that couldn't see the backstage scrambling. That night, she showed up at the house. A neighbor texted me, asking if everything was okay. I imagined her standing at the door, phone in hand, rehearsing how she would reframe this as a misunderstanding once I answered. I didn't. By morning, the panic set in. Not emotional. Strategic. She wasn't afraid of losing me yet. She was afraid of losing control of the narrative. She had built her momentum on access. To rooms. To people. To quiet solutions that appeared effortless because someone else handled them. Now those doors stayed closed. And for the first time, she wasn't chasing me. She was chasing stability. And it wasn't answering. Pressure doesn't need a push. It just needs a weak point. Daniel Ross had one. I didn't go looking for him. I didn't have to. Men like him leave trails because they assume no one will follow them without permission. His leverage wasn't money. It was timing. He positioned himself where urgency was high and scrutiny was low, then let people compromise themselves for access. All I did was notice where his name appeared too often. A zoning variance here. A delayed compliance review there. Nothing illegal on its own. Just a pattern of shortcuts justified by influence. I didn't expose it. I didn't threaten it. I redirected attention toward it. A call to an old contact in procurement, framed as a clarification request. A forwarded document to a compliance officer who appreciated clean questions. A quiet reminder that certain approvals required updated disclosures now, not later. I never attached my name. Within 48 hours, Ross's calendar started to collapse. Not publicly, privately. Meetings postponed. Advisors suddenly unavailable. His firm's legal team inserting themselves where they hadn't been before. He noticed. That was when he reached out to her. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw the aftermath. Her next post was rushed. Her next interview clipped short. She canceled an appearance she'd been promoting for weeks, citing scheduling conflicts. Behind the scenes, her funding round stalled. Ross didn't pull out dramatically. He did something worse. He paused. He asked for patience. He reminded her that momentum was fragile and perception mattered. He stopped answering immediately. That night, she called me again. Not angry this time. Controlled, but thin. She said something external was happening. That people were being unfair. That she needed me to step back in and stabilize things like I always had. I didn't pick up. By morning, she tried a different angle. She framed it as teamwork. As history. As something we'd built together that deserved protection. I stayed silent. Ross's vulnerability wasn't scandal. It was exposure. He needed things to move quietly. When they didn't, his interest shifted. He had other companies. Other founders willing to trade proximity for reassurance. By the end of the week, he was gone. No confrontation. No explanation. Just absence. She felt it immediately. The energy around her changed. People stopped orbiting. Invitations slowed. Advisors spoke more carefully. She still had her company. She still had her image. What she lost was the illusion that access could be replaced as easily as it had been acquired. And for the first time, she realized that whatever had walked out of that door wasn't just a husband. It was infrastructure, and it wasn't coming back on demand. The fallout didn't start online. It started in rooms she wasn't in. Her name still carried weight, but the tone changed when people said it. Less admiration, more caution. Conversations shortened when she entered. Smiles didn't linger. Nobody confronted her. They didn't need to. Distance did the work. I saw it through secondhand movement. A mutual acquaintance forwarded an invite list for a private industry dinner. Her name was missing. Someone else's startup, smaller and less polished, had taken her place. The explanation was logistical. Capacity issues. Last-minute adjustments. Everyone understood what that meant. At a family gathering I didn't attend, her sister asked where I was. Not casually. With intent. Someone answered that we were giving each other space. The phrase landed wrong. Too rehearsed. Her mother went quiet after that. At work, her team started protecting themselves. Advisors began documenting conversations. Assistants confirmed instructions twice. Nobody wanted to be the one blamed if momentum didn't return. She noticed. She tried to compensate by being louder. More visible. She scheduled appearances back-to-back, flooded her channels with optimism, talked about resilience and focus. The performance was polished, but the rhythm was off. She was reacting instead of leading. One afternoon, she attended a roundtable she'd helped organize months earlier. The seating had changed. She wasn't at the center. A younger founder was. Someone with fewer credentials, but steadier backing. She smiled through it. Applauded. Took photos. Afterward, no one followed her out. That night, she texted me again. Longer this time. She talked about how people were misreading things, how rumors had a way of spreading when silence filled the gaps. She said we should present a united front, that it would settle everyone. I didn't answer. The next day, one of her closest friends unfollowed her. No explanation. Just gone. Another stopped returning calls. A third suggested time apart, framed as self-care. It wasn't rejection. It was recalibration. People sense instability before it's visible. They drift toward gravity, not chaos. Without me anchoring the background, her orbit widened too fast. By the end of the week, she sat alone at an event she used to command. Still invited, still respected, but no longer essential. Across the room, someone said something she couldn't hear. A laugh followed, then a glance in her direction that didn't include her. She finally understood that no one was attacking her. They were adjusting to her absence of control, and the one person who could have stabilized it wasn't missing. He was just no longer participating. Isolation doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. She didn't lose everything at once. She lost responses. Delays stretched. Messages went unanswered just long enough to feel intentional. Meetings that used to run over ended early. People stopped lingering. I saw her once during that stretch. Not by accident. I knew where she would be. It was a public space tied to an industry conference she still had access to, though barely. I arrived early and took a seat along the edge, not hiding, not approaching. I was there the way infrastructure is there, unnoticed until it's missing. She walked in, scanning the room, posture practiced, expression calibrated. She saw me and paused for half a second, just enough for relief to flash before she shut it down. She adjusted her jacket and moved toward me like this was planned. I didn't stand. She sat across from me and started talking immediately. Not about us. About logistics. About how things had gotten messy. About how people were misunderstanding her intentions. She spoke the way she always did when she needed something stabilized quietly. I listened without reacting. She mentioned Ross without naming him. Said his attention had shifted unexpectedly. Said investors were fickle. Said she needed someone steady in her corner. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't ask questions. The silence stretched longer than she expected. She filled it by talking faster, by reminding me of shared history, by reframing the past as teamwork rather than convenience. I stayed still. Eventually, she noticed that nothing she said was changing the air between us. Her voice lowered. She asked if I was punishing her. I didn't answer that either. When she finished, I stood, nodded once, and walked away. I didn't look back. That was the moment isolation settled in for her. Not because I left, but because I was there and unreachable. Over the next days, her attempts became less strategic and more personal. Messages lost their polish. Timing slipped. She oscillated between distance and urgency, between professionalism and familiarity. None of it landed. Without my presence absorbing friction, everything reached her directly. Every doubt, every delay, every sideways look. She had built her momentum on shared weight, and now she carried it alone. Meanwhile, my life simplified. Fewer calls, clearer days. Systems running exactly as designed because they were no longer compensating for someone else's volatility. She was surrounded by people and still alone. I was alone by choice and completely intact. That difference widened quietly, and she felt every inch of it. The confrontation didn't happen where she planned it. She wanted a private setting, somewhere neutral, where tone could be managed and outcomes softened. Instead, it happened in motion, between commitments, with no room to rehearse. She caught up to me in a lobby crowded with people moving in different directions. Not loud, not dramatic, just unavoidable. She matched my pace and started talking as if the conversation had already been agreed to. She said she needed clarity. She said the silence was unfair. She said adults didn't handle things this way. I kept walking. She adjusted, lowering her voice, shifting tactics. She said she didn't understand when things had gone wrong. She said pressure had changed her. She said she had made choices she thought were necessary. I didn't slow down. She stepped in front of me then, just briefly, forcing eye contact. Her expression cracked for the first time since this began. Not anger. Calculation failing. She asked if I was done. If this was it. I stopped. Not for long. I told her that I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't confused. I told her I had simply stepped out of a system that no longer recognized my role. That was all. No accusations. No recounting. No appeal. She started to respond, but I was already moving again. The conversation ended because I left it, not because it reached resolution. Later that day, she sent a message trying to reclaim control of the moment. She reframed it as mutual distance, as something we both needed, as a pause. I didn't correct her. The next messages came faster. She asked if we could meet again. She asked if we could talk without distractions. She asked what it would take to fix this. I didn't answer. By the end of the week, she tried silence herself, the kind meant to provoke, to remind me of absence. It didn't work, because absence only has power when it's unexpected. She showed up again days later, this time at my office. She didn't ask permission. She walked in like she used to, assuming access was permanent. Security stopped her. She waited. Watched people pass. Watched doors open for others and not for her. When she finally saw me through the glass, relief crossed her face again. Then uncertainty. I didn't come out. That was when she understood the shift. She wasn't being negotiated with. She had already been exited, and whatever version of me she thought she could pull back into place no longer existed within reach. The door hadn't been slammed. It had been closed properly. The collapse didn't come with noise. It arrived the way fatigue does, after the adrenaline fades and the body realizes it has been compensating for too long. Her schedule thinned first. Not publicly, but in the margins. Appearances shortened. Panels turned into fireside chats. Fireside chats turned into moderated Q&A. Then cancellations justified by focus and restructuring. The language stayed optimistic. The reality didn't. People stopped asking her opinion before making decisions. They informed her afterward. Advisors began talking in contingencies. Words like if and pending replaced certainty. She was still involved, but no longer central. The real damage showed up in moments no one posted. A meeting where she pitched an update and the room stayed polite but disengaged. A follow-up email that received acknowledgments instead of enthusiasm. A call where someone suggested revisiting terms later when things were clearer. Clearer meant without risk. Ross was gone completely by then. Not hostile, not apologetic, just unreachable. His attention had moved on to something cleaner. Someone who didn't need stabilizing. She tried to replace him. The effort showed. New conversations started but didn't deepen. Promising introductions stalled. The momentum she once borrowed couldn't be leased twice. At home, the quiet turned oppressive. The house felt larger without resistance. She moved things around, changed lighting, rearranged spaces that had never bothered her before. None of it settled. She replayed moments she'd dismissed at the time. Me standing behind her at events, quiet but present. Me answering messages she never saw. Me smoothing conversations she never knew were close to breaking. Back then, it felt invisible. Now it felt intentional. She reached out again. Not to negotiate. Not to argue. The message was stripped of strategy. She said she hadn't realized how much weight I carried until it was gone. She said she had mistaken availability for permanence. I read it once. I didn't respond. By then, she wasn't losing status. She was losing orientation. The sense that someone else understood the system well enough to absorb impact. Without that, every decision felt heavier, every risk sharper. I watched none of this directly. I didn't need to. The reports came quietly. From people who didn't mean to inform me. From shifts in tone. From absence where presence used to be assumed. Her world hadn't ended, but it had narrowed. And she was finally alone with the consequences of choices she once thought were leverage. The last thing she lost wasn't me. It was certainty, and it didn't come back. The final moment wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation waiting for closure, no last attempt to reclaim what had already shifted out of reach. It happened quietly, the way structural decisions always do, after the noise has burned itself out. She asked to meet one last time. Not urgently, not emotionally. The message was careful, almost restrained, as if she finally understood that pressure only pushed me farther away. She framed it as clarity, as respect, as a conversation between two people who had shared a life and needed to acknowledge what it had become. I agreed. We met in a public place where neither of us had leverage. She arrived composed, dressed for confidence rather than attention. She didn't lead with apologies. She didn't justify herself. She spoke about perspective, about how ambition can distort priorities, about how she hadn't realized when partnership had turned into something transactional. I listened without interruption. She said she finally understood that when she told me to get out of her space, she hadn't meant for me to leave permanently. She had expected me to adjust, like always, to wait until she was ready to pull me back in. I told her that I had heard her correctly the first time. There was a pause after that, not uncomfortable, just final. She looked at me as if she were seeing the outline of something she had assumed would always be solid, something she could step away from and return to unchanged. She asked if there was any version of us left. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was weighing the question, but because it no longer required one. The system she had relied on to catch her missteps no longer existed. Not out of spite, out of choice. I told her that I hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. That was the only sentence I gave her. She nodded, absorbing it slowly, the way people do when they realize the negotiation is over and what remains is acceptance. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She thanked me for meeting her. I left first. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because something painful had ended, but because something misaligned no longer needed maintenance. I returned to a life that functioned without friction, without compensation, without being asked to dim itself for someone else's momentum. She continued forward too, just without the safety net she once mistook for convenience. Funny how that works. The wrong person walked out, and the right one never came back. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.